more data is not always better observability. Some teams will rely on distributed tracing. They find it super valuable. And some other teams don't use it that much. That's the caveat of like having things out of the box. Is like, you have it out of the box, it's super easy, but then you need to make sure that people use it, that people see the value, that people use the tooling, that people use the observability data that is provided to them to change those legacy practices that they may have for like years or sometimes decades.
Hello, I'm Martin Thwaites.
And I'm Jessica Kerr.
And you're listening to Observability Cast, or o11ycast for short, a monthly series where we talk about how we can make production systems more observable, more reliable, and easy to maintain. o11ycast is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com.
If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us on Twitter at o11ycast. That's at o11ycast.
I work with many teams to basically adopt best practices in observability. And there are many patterns and many themes that I see, that just come up over and over again. And there's a lot of experience that I've basically got from working with those teams to adopt those best practices. And Skyscanner as well has been going through a journey of adopting new standards for observability, adopting OpenTelemetry. So I just wanted to share that basically with everyone else, and also to share that with, all the engineers, not only at Skyscanner, but across the world that may be adopting OpenTelemetry and going through a similar journey. So that was the reason. Also, I had 5 weeks sabbatical that I decided to spend focusing on that book, so I just could, basically get it done.
In 5 weeks?
Well, it was not only done in 5 weeks, but I did take 5 weeks to really, focus on it, which helped a lot. Otherwise, I would still be writing it probably.
Yeah, there is that idea of, you need to get a little bit of focus to at least get yourself over that initial, what's it going to look like? And then you get your motivation and then you can start doing it. I have that problem quite a lot.
So when you were convincing teams about best practices, I imagine it added a sense of authority to be like, here's the book. Someone published it.
There is that as well, yeah. I just wanted to put that into one single place that people can refer to, basically, as in okay, these are the things people can identify. Hopefully, some other end users as well can identify with some of the themes and some of the little pieces of advice and little notes that are across the book. So, we face that problem with cardinality explosion, or we face that problem with really high costs on login. So that's what I was trying to sort of hint at during the book and say, well, this is how you may solve it with OpenTelemetry. This is how OpenTelemetry helps.
Nice. Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name is Dan Gomez-Blanco. I'm a principal engineer at Skyscanner, and I work in the production platform tribe, so platform engineering. But I work across the organization to basically drive the strategy of our observability and operational monitoring. And recently as well, I've been elected to be part of the OpenTelemetry governance committee and to bring as well a bit of an end user perspective to the community as well in that sense.
How did you become in charge of observability? What got you excited about that?
Who did you hurt that made you in charge of that?
It was I think it's been a journey, I think, for me as well. So before I joined Skyscanner, I used to work for a startup that then was acquired by Skyscanner. It was related to JVM tuning, but then when I moved to Skyscanner, I started to work on RUM, on real user monitoring, basically improving the performance of our websites as users see it, right? I started to work on pipelines for, back in those days, we didn't have some of the instrumentation that we've got now. So basically working on pipelines to ingest all that data from our users' devices, from browser. And then from then on, I moved on to distributed tracing, which at the time we were using open tracing. And then it just sort of evolved into a sort of wider observability, sort of including metrics, logging, and so on, being able to integrate all that. And then as part of that, basically driving the strategy to adopt OpenTelemetry and then changes happening in how we simplified our infrastructure and our pipelines and our telemetry backends and so on.
So it started with Rum and with trying to improve the experience for real users?
Indeed. It started with client side, with Rum, and correlating basically the impact of client side performance on things like user conversion or even revenue, right?
So it started directly from value.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically where it started from. Like, this is why speed matters. And that's so like, when I say speed matters, it was that Google, forgot the exact name of the blog post, but when Google came up with Core Web Vitals, and they said something like around speed matters and why it matters to users and why it matters to your organization as well.
Yeah, something like, is it like an extra half second is worth X amount in conversion or something like that?
Yeah, it was that one, yeah.
It's the one that everybody cites. And I can't remember who it was that pointed out, but one of those surveys was very specifically 20 years ago or something, or 30 years ago, and things have moved on as to whether Core Web Vitals is actually the right metric nowadays. But, you know, it is a metric and it's a good number that we can start to improve on. And I think everybody can accept that we hit websites, they run slow, we get annoyed, we either move on or we wait and come back the next day, and eventually we'll just move on anyway. So I think it is very visceral to everybody that they know that slow means bad experience. How slow? You know, there's diminishing returns. Did you have like targets that you put in yourself that you were monitoring those conversions, that you saw that half a second, that 1 second for particular journeys? Was that where this was born out of, or was it just that Google says?
Well, I mean, there's two parts of that. Like, the first one is like, yeah, Google says this, and then, you know, you get ranked on, like, your SEO ranking may depend on those Core Web Vitals, so that's a direct impact, right? But then there's also other areas where, like, you know, not just related to Core Web Vitals in terms of like performance of different aspects that are custom, that's specific to your application. Like, for example, for Skyscanner, like, we have done experiments that show that if we take too long to load results from search results for our flight searches, then that affects how people interact with the product and if they continue to book or if they drop. I mean, that is clearly, like, we can see a direct correlation of basically at what point there's normally a threshold, and that's where you normally have your threshold for your SLO, right? Like, you're saying, like, okay, so after this threshold, people start to get angry.
And I suppose, is that the reason why you went for tracing first? So it sounds like you went from Rum into open tracing.
Personally, yes. Personally, when I found distributed tracing and tried to find the correlation between that all the way, you know, I was already starting to think of the concept that we're talking about now in OpenTelemetry with the client instrumentation or the client-side instrumentation working group, and sort of like, how do you connect what happens in the browser with end users? How do you connect that to your backend services? But yeah, so like what drove me to open tracing and to sort of like to the other areas was like, it was more of a change of teams at the time, but then trying to get the sort of what happens in your front end, sort of like your back end for front end, how does that correlate to all the back end services and their dependencies all the way down to the infrastructure, basically, at the end of the day.
So you had Rum and you started with the generic Core Web Vitals, and then you moved on to stuff that was specific to your application, and you're measuring that. And then when you want to make it faster, then you get into tracing?
Yeah, I mean, well, that was part of why we started to rely more on tracing as Skyscanner, is to understand, you know, what is happening within a complex distributed system, right? To serve a particular flight search, for example, you will be hitting many microservices within our service mesh. So how do you know like what's actually contributing to that slowness that you can see, right? What is give me the slowest samples of that, like the slowest traces, and then start to identify patterns on that. That is why we started to rely more on that. And then that's why I was trying to sell that as well to the rest of the organization and saying like, actually, this is important. This is why we need tracing, right? What we were missing at the time was that link between what happens in the browser and what happens in the back end, which is something that OpenTelemetry is now helping to bridge that gap between Rum and your distributed tracing in the back end.
Yeah. And for that, you need the application specific, hey, this is what matters measurement that you created. So it sounds like you've got a direct path from value to the organization, and then you had to roll this out across teams?
Yeah, I think the reason why this is coming from sort of like a platform engineering team is that at Skyscanner, we have invested quite heavily on developer enablement. So as I said in a few talks already, what we're trying to achieve is that the golden path should be the path of least resistance, right? Is making it super easy for every engineer. Like if we've got like 80 teams, but you've got 80 teams that need to do the same thing over and over again, right? Which is like instrument your backend or basically set up the OpenTelemetry SDK or some configuration for like how you want to emit your metrics or your traces, where to emit them to, and all that basically configuration around the default is something that we integrate with the rest of our applications in a way that it just comes out of the box.
Do you have like a wrapper library?
Yeah, exactly. So it handles more than telemetry, but we sort of like implement that into that library and into the base images, into the Docker base images that we maintain as Skyscanner, so that service owners get a lot of this thing like out of the box. We don't use specific OpenTelemetry distro, for example. In a way, that's our distro, right? We set the defaults as an enablement function within the organization, and then we sort of like promote those over different channels to the rest of the company.
Okay, so you have, I mean, effectively a distro, but it's not only a distro. It does a bunch of other do things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think the idea of make the right thing the easy thing is true not just in telemetry, it's true everywhere. Like nobody's going to choose to do the hard thing if it's the wrong thing as well. But if I don't, well, a much smaller number of developers. Yeah, I mean, there are some people who do like that kind of environment. But what I'm saying is, I mean, I think inherently developers are lazy people. We want to do things that make our lives easier. We want to
get a particular thing done, and that thing is not typically configuring an OpenTelemetry exporter.
Yeah. We want to do the thing that's fun for us. We want to do the thing that's on our plate. We don't want to have to care about the things that are around that thing. We don't want to have to go and do all the yak shaving. Like, that is not something we want to do. But if something doesn't exist, we're going to go and do that yak shaving, and we're going to try and make it interesting.
Then we're going to get distracted, and then we're just going to focus on observability, and then we're going to have to move to the platform team.
So, that idea of just get all of that out of their way, make it easy for them so that, I need to do that thing. I could build it all myself, or I could just add this one line into my code and then I can get back to doing my job.
Yeah.
I think that's what a lot of people miss when they start to build platform.
But do the teams at Skyscanner, do they use that telemetry data? Do they go look at traces?
Yeah, all the time. And that's something that is specific to each team. Some teams will, rely on distributed tracing. So every team gets it out of the box, basically. Some teams use it all the time. They find it super valuable. And some other teams don't use it that much. But then, that's the caveat of like having things out of the box is like, you have it out of the box, it's super easy, but then you need to make sure that people use it, that people see the value, that people use the tooling, that people use the observability data that is provided to them to change those legacy practices that they may have for like years or, I don't know, sometimes decades. No, in our case, but like, I just imagine, for example, one team that, they relied on logs and metrics always, right? Then you give them traces out of the box, but their runbooks still basically point them to run this particular query for logs or like look at this.
Oh, the runbooks still point to the logging tool.
Exactly. So like there's not like an incentive to sort of like use tracing if you've never used it and nobody explains to you the advantages of it, right? So I think that's one of the most difficult things of like observability adoption is people and like the practices of different teams rather than the tooling. The tool is you can generate a lot of data out of the box and super valuable data. But yeah.
So when teams like get the observability out of the box, then their services traces are fitting into the wider picture. And that can help everybody.
Yeah.
But then we want that development team to get the value too. So how do you go about evangelizing tracing?
One of the things that I found recently that I found really, really powerful is to do hands-on exercises with the OpenTelemetry demo. So like in the demo, you've got feature flags and you can create incidents. You can create regressions in the OpenTelemetry demo. And then use your tooling, whatever tooling that is, because it integrates with many vendors and open source solutions. So whatever you're using in your production environment, you can then tell your teams, basically drive that through teams and say, okay, I'm going to put that in there. Go and debug it. Like, you don't know anything about this application, about this OpenTelemetry demo. Go and debug that particular regression. And then they see actually that when you explain that here's a happy path to debug this, they will see that, the way to get to the regression, to the root cause, is normally through distributed tracing first. So that is the entry point. And then when you divide that, you sort of like gamify it a little bit.
Okay, because they don't have runbooks for the OTel demo that point to their logging.
Exactly. So without runbooks, start from scratch. And then you normally divide it in teams. What we do is we divide it in teams and they compete against each other. Who finds the root cause faster?
Fun.
And then the one that sort of finds it first, they get a little bit of a prize as well. So it's gamifying the incident sort of root cause analysis. And then normally what we see is that, always the ones that are using tracing will be the ones that find it first.
Yeah. We had a customer recently who they were having this root cause thing where lots of incidents were going on, and one team was always the people who found the root cause first. They said they were cheating because they were using distributed tracing. They were finding it quicker. Well, they're using distributed tracing. They're obviously going to be faster. Like, okay. Can you just say that again in your head and listen to yourself, Yeah. So what's going on with the governance committee then? You've done all this amazing stuff, and that's one of the things that I was pushing for with the committee, was to get somebody like yourself on there that was for the end users and not for vendors, because you don't work for a vendor. You have no affiliation with a vendor. So getting somebody like that on the committee, I thought was one of the priorities that we needed to do anyway. So I was very happy when you did. So what are your plans for the committee? What is it you're trying to do with the community around observability?
Yep. So I think, I'm still trying to get my feet on the ground, but starting now to think about the future, basically. I think part of the reason why I was chosen to be there is to represent end users within that group, right? And my idea is to try to incorporate that end user feedback and all the fantastic work that's been done in the end user working group as well, and then try to basically close the feedback loop. One of the things that I sometimes see that in OpenTelemetry we're not that good at is saying, linking the user feedback that we're getting, the challenges that end users have, with the actions and with the features that are getting delivered, right? So I think it's there. It's just, clearly we're doing things that matter, but how does that relate to end users? And that's something that sometimes is just a matter of explain or clearly articulating that this is helping all these people basically in their day to day, and trying to get that feedback loop basically to be closed and to iterate over it.
Yeah, sometimes as developers, we get really fascinated by the how and we lose touch with the why.
Yeah, I think that is one of the key themes for me is, try to make end users I think they're heard and they're listened to, but try to see how things relate, basically.
I'm really glad you're on that committee. Also, thanks for writing the book.
Oh, thanks for reading it.
You mentioned something earlier that I wanted to dig into. You were talking about patterns for dealing with different challenges of observability. What are the patterns for controlling costs?
That is probably one of the things that drives at least in my case, as I've seen, that drives some of the moves towards better observability. Believe it or not, what we've done is give users an idea of how much data they're producing. Because at the end of the day, it might be one way or another, the amount of data that you produce or that you store or that you transfer through over the wire, it will have an impact on cost, right? So one of the things that we do at Skyscanner is try to basically put that data in front of the engineering teams themselves, not just for telemetry, but also for cloud costs and all that. So like it's split by team. So each team is responsible for their own costs. And what we've seen, for example, in terms of costs, were teams that were like, the moment that we started doing that with telemetry, they said, the majority of my costs are coming from login, right? Because it's very verbose and like, basically they saw that. And the moment that they saw that, they said, well, actually, maybe we should look into this tracing thing where we've got like tail sampling. And with tail sampling, we can keep only, what matters. Like we can keep the traces that matter, right? I can go into more detail on how tail sampling works. But in general, basically, we're keeping what matters, like the slowest transactions, the ones that contain errors. And then when they did that, they said, okay, so now that we've got that, we can then stop all that debug level login or the sort of like access login. And then some of them even got to save 90% of their costs on login.
Wow. Okay.
It's quite a lot of money, in the long run. And then basically just stop like very verbose login, add attributes to spans, get the traces to be tail sampled, and then get better observability because they get more context with a distributed trace and the services that are part of their dependencies, and then also save costs. So that's why I keep saying that more data is not always better observability. That's one of my mottos.
Nice. So by giving people visibility into their costs, and not just their observability costs, but using observability to give them visibility into AWS costs or cloud costs, you were able to reduce costs around the board.
Indeed, yeah.
And I love that it actually helped drive people toward the practices you were already wanting them to use because they also get more value.
Yep, indeed. And also, I would say that one of the things that helped us here tremendously is OpenTelemetry semantic conventions, because it makes it super easy to split things by, service namespace, for example, which we can match a service namespace to the owners of that namespace. So then we can say, okay, so all the telemetry that's produced by this particular service will be annotated with the service name in the service namespace. So it's just a matching exercise then later to attribute it. Before that, before we were using OpenTelemetry, there was just a log, a data point, whatever. But you wouldn't know where it came from, right?
Where did it come from?
And then you go to the team and they say, we tag it. It's like, okay, so how do you tag it? It's like, we use NS equals.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like, right, okay. And then somebody else says, we use names. Yeah. Where we just abbreviate space to S but keep names. It's like,
I put initials on all my debugs.
Or someone else, we were like, we call it SVC_name.
Yeah. And it's like, wait, which environment is it? Well, it's in pre-prod or staging or UAT or pre-production or PP or can you just use the same names, please?
Right. Yeah, there's a consistency there that we need. And OpenTelemetry has done a lot of work in figuring out what we need to be consistent. Stuff like service name and some standard HTTP fields and so on, while allowing any kind of attribute that might be specific to your specific service or application. It's not restrictive.
Yeah, it's a mix of best of both worlds, I guess.
And then you didn't have to tell people not to log. You just showed them what it was costing them.
Oh no, we did as well.
Okay.
We have a carrot, but we have a stick. No, I think we need to. There's a little bit of governance as well, right? To make sure that we're producing valuable data. We try to help people with visualizations and how to basically, get the most out of it. And then there is the evangelizing as well of best practices and the training and so on.
I love that training. Yeah, because I think of it as as a platform team, you don't have to tell people exactly what to do, but you can give teams an API to meet. And that API includes things like put your service name in the service name.
Yeah, it makes it easy as well for platform engineers as well. If you're supporting infrastructure, if you're supporting pipelines, and everyone that's done that at a certain scale will know that it's very easy for a company to DDoS themselves. So we've seen that. We're someone decided to add just a new metric tag or something that is called infinite cardinality, and then sort of everything goes boom. But you need to basically make sure that you get the accountability for that as well. So it's easy for us with OpenTelemetry conventions to say, okay, this is where it's coming from. We know this, we can block it, we can limit it, so on.
So semantic conventions are the Git blame of the OpenTelemetry community.
No way.
Some of them. And you mentioned people started adding attributes to spans instead of logging.
Mm-hmm.
And yet with metrics, you have to be careful what attributes you add.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the, when we were talking about how enablement teams make it super easy to follow the golden path. The other side of that coin is that when we've got all these layers of abstractions and everything comes out of the box, it's quite easy for teams to, forget the best practices, forget what matters. So then when they do their custom instrumentation, they may not be completely aware that adding a new attribute to a metric that has, the unique user ID for a particular endpoint will have a detrimental impact on your pipelines and on your cost and so on.
Right, because metrics, for every piece of information you add, the amount of data you need to store expands geometrically.
Yes, yeah. One of the things that we've got in our guidance as well, and what OpenTelemetry helps, is try to make people understand that you don't need that high cardinality metric if you can aggregate it and then correlate it to high granularity spans and traces, right? And this is where it all comes into the same context and the same stream of correlated data, which is what OpenTelemetry tries to provide, right? So if you've got lower cardinality metrics that are correlated via exemplars, for example, to high cardinality or high granularity spans and traces, then you get the best of both worlds. You can then go and aggregate your metrics as something that is sensible, that you can graph, that you can put on a dashboard, or that you can alert on. And then when there is a regression on that, you want to be able to see what are the individual samples that basically correlate to that particular regression. So that's basically the sort of advice that we're trying to give, is use the telemetry, each signal for its best use case, and then correlate them all. So then what you end up, if you do that, normally you end up with better data, lower cost, but also better observability in general. Even for people that do not rely on metrics, so they don't want to rely on metrics that much, it does come with is the as I was saying, the legacy of using metrics. It's difficult to get people out of that as well, right? So
use the signals for what they're best at.
Yeah, and I've been accused more than once of hating on one particular signal. And the reality is they all have a use. And it's like anything in life. They have a use. It's when that, the whole sort of hammer and nail, the screw in the nail. Mm-hmm. If all I've got is a hammer, the entire world is a nail.
Yeah. I can fall in love with tracing, but then I go try to apply it to a front-end application and no, it doesn't work, but logs do. With correlated logs, right, with session ID and trace ID on them, because like you said, hooking the signals together lets you get the strength of each.
Yeah. And it is, you use those signals for the right things, but know when you're using the signal for the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. I think that's the hard part. Is this the right signal for the sort of task that I'm trying to do? Am I using metrics when I should be using tracing? Am I using tracing when I should be using logs? Am I using logs when I should be using metrics?
Do you get questions from teams about that?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah. So questions from teams around instrument, basically what should they be using? Yeah, absolutely. I think there's another one as well, as Martin was saying, is what they should not be instrumenting themselves, which is another topic entirely now with auto-instrumentation, right? As we're moving from a world where if you wanted to instrument a metric or tracing basically for a particular library, you had to do it yourself. We're moving to a world where we've got so much auto-instrumentation out of the box with OpenTelemetry that you should not instrument something that is already instrumented by either library authors or instrumentation authors.
Yeah, so don't add a metric for HTTP count. Don't add a span for a HTTP call because, those are already there. Augment the HTTP call with more data. Don't add a new span for it if you don't need to.
Yeah, we used to have even wrappers for Redis clients, for example. The only thing that the wrapper would do for a Redis client is try to capture some metrics in our custom. So back in the day in our custom protocol or custom SDKs and all that. And now it's just use the Redis instrumentation.
Okay, so you said you have an internal library that does some wrapping of things for do things, right?
Yeah, we're trying to move away from those.
Yeah. Well, now all your library has to do is bring an OTel.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be responsible for making that up.
Also, there's a point of if you've got something that you're interested in instrumenting and is not there, instead of doing it yourself, you can contribute that back to the community, right? So you can contribute back and then say, well, this is not instrumented by this library, it doesn't exist yet. We're going to propose that, work on that, and then basically instead of building something that's only specific to your company, you're sort of sharing that as well, right? And then getting the benefits from it.
The great thing about that is now you've got 400 people that are arguing about naming instead of the 3 in your organization.
That is also true.
But once it's in, then it's an industry standard and no one in your organization can argue about it anymore.
I mean, there's benefits and drawbacks.
So if you want a different set of people to argue with.
Yeah, and arguing with people on the internet is so much fun. I think one of the things that you're getting at there is over-instrumentation. How do we stop people from doing over-instrumentation? Well, how do we stop people from creating more data than they need? And we did that with logging. You alluded to that at the start, where 90% of that logging was something that people weren't using. That was over-instrumentation. I mean, you fix that by moving to tracing and having fewer of those spans kept by reducing that over-instrumentation. But I think it's also prevalent in tracing, it's prevalent in metrics, and there's a lot of organizations that are now taking that metrics idea and looking at the metrics that you do use and getting rid of some of the stuff that you don't, which is a really interesting concept around this idea of over-instrumentation, where can your backends tell you that you're over-instrumented rather than you actually looking at the code and saying you're over-instrumented? And that's, I think, some areas that I think that we're going to be seeing a lot more of over the next sort of year or two around how do we detect over-instrumentation.
Or detect instrumentation quality in a way, right? So I think that's a really interesting concept. If you could measure how well your system is instrumented, right? Are you correlating things? Are you propagating context correctly? Have you got duplicated things that, as you said, well, you've got too much logging, but that's already covered by your traces and so on. So that's a really interesting area and a really interesting topic. I think at the moment, basically what we've got is enabling teams that have that purpose to come up with those defaults, right? For what's the minimum instrumentation that you need to operate something and then build on top of that, right? That approach, I think, has worked quite well for us. We're we start from the minimum and then we build up on top of that rather than try to cut back later. You say, okay, do you need this? Do you need this instrumentation? Do you need this? Do you need this metric? Is it used in any dashboard or alert? Or are you just adding data just for adding it?
And if you have visibility into costs, then you have some sort of signal of when it's time to maybe look at that metrics you don't need anymore kind of thing.
Yeah.
I like the part where your team has this expertise and shares it with other teams as they need it, because while we want every developer to implement a tiny bit of instrumentation and to use the traces, you don't need to be an expert. We can't all be an expert in everything.
I think there's another group of people that help. If your organization is a sort of a particular size, where you've got, for example, dozens of teams, right? Having one single team that is responsible for just basically following best practices does not scale that well, because, they might be the experts in telemetry instrumentation. They might be the experts in OpenTelemetry configuration, but they're not going to be the experts in the custom things that people care about to monitor and to instrument in their applications. So this is where having a group a cross-organization group, right? We call it observability ambassadors or champions or heroes, multiple names that you can have for that sort of group, where they may not be experts in observability, but they're interested in the topic. They can learn and share that knowledge within their teams. And then they become sort of the point of contact, right? Because they know the context around what matters to them.
Yes. Okay. I love that structure where you have someone in the team who is the designated observability kind of liaison. They don't have to be experts if they have the interest, they will become experts
Yeah.
as they go to your group and get their questions answered and take that back to their team and integrate their specific application knowledge with the more general practices that you can share.
I think that's one of the keys of observability versus sort of the older monitoring school is it requires your context. It requires that team's context. It's not something that you can rely solely on auto-instrumentation.
You don't just tack it on.
Exactly. You need that team to say, oh yeah, what would be really interesting here is the duration of the flight when they're away. That's actually a really nice thing for us to know about. Like, there's no auto-instrumentation package that's going to take the flight number from the HTTP request and add that to a span. That might be important in the context of one team. It might be important in the context of one company. But it's not going to be important in the wider community. So you need to provide that context. And I think that's where that difference comes in. So having those champions in your organization that know that domain and say, that's going to be really important. You should probably think about putting that in. And this is how you might do it. And I know who I can talk to about making it the most efficient. Bringing all of that together, that's gold.
Yeah, I appreciate that we're starting to think more systemically now in the sense of, if you want quality, you don't get that by hiring a quality team and tacking it on to the organization. And it's the same with observability. A lot of the work is with the people, is integrating the practices into every team. It sounds like you are deeply engaged in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, they can help on the other side. I mean, we're talked about mostly about like instrumentation here, but like they can help on the other side as well on the alerting and the best practices.
Oh.
So like if you start to go through the sort of like SRE practices of like, are you suffering from alert fatigue? Or, they can be the ones that can give advice as well. Or what is a good SLO? Or what is a good SLI basically to set a target on? That's sort of like that level of like knowledge, which they can apply that to their domain. And then that's not something that, someone that is outside of a team will not be able to tell you what a good SLI is for your service, right? That's so specific to each service.
Do you help them create the SLI once they define it?
Yeah, that's in a way they are sort of like responsible for that, right? So if they've got an SLI, so they would be responsible for that as well.
Martin, there was an invitation earlier to talk more about tail sampling.
Yes, sampling is amazing. And it's one of those things that's done wrong so many times.
Yeah, so how do you do it? Does your team take charge of sampling?
In our case, we use our vendors' capabilities for tail sampling. The reason for this is that we have a multi-cluster service mesh. So in a way, like one of the caveats of tail sampling, it is amazing. You can do it in the OpenTelemetry collector as well yourself. It's got a tail sampling processor. But then all your traces, so all your spans for a given trace need to end up in the same collector replica, right? If you've got a multi-cluster service mesh, it's a bit more challenging because then communication can go across clusters and it becomes a bit more challenging, right? The way we do it is we use our vendors' capabilities to be able to do that. But the idea here is the same, right? You're basically, what we end up storing, more or less, is around 5 to 6% of the traces that we generate, because we're keeping, every single trace that's got an error in it, keeping traces that I think is around 1% of random of all of them. And then we're keeping the 1% sort of like slowest, or basically the slowest traces, depending on the root span, right? The entry point of the system. What are your slowest transactions? So that's basically the beauty of tail sampling, is that comes out at 5%.
Nice.
And I think it's really difficult. It was originally, I remember when we started with tail sampling in a past, like we used to use another vendor, right, in the past. And it was a really hard sell. Originally, it was a really hard sell, because the moment that you tell someone, we're only going to keep 5% of your data, they were like, oh yeah, but what if I miss something? And then the moment that they start using it and they realize during an incident is that, no, everything that you need is there. you don't need that other 95%, which is like all 200s, all goods, no slow, blah, blah, blah. So the more that they use, they will actually, no, you're right. we don't need that other 95%.
Yeah, I mean, that is where the magic is trying to work out exactly where the right point is to draw the line. Also being able to move that line as well and actively change it. I think that a lot of people, like you say, the trauma of, oh, we'll just take 5% of the traces. They're like, yeah, but that other 95% I might need. It's like...
But with tail sampling, you get to be careful about which 5%.
Exactly. It's like, I only get the 5% that I need. It's like, but how do you know? I'm like, tell me what it is that you need. Well, if something's going to be slow, I'm going to do it. Oh, okay, well, let's keep the slow ones. And they're like, but I can't do that. And I'm like, yes, you can. That's what tail sampling is. That's what using those rules is all about. And if you then maintain that context, you can still get back to those real values.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that idea of how do you group traces together? How do you say that things are similar? And it's complicated. It's not as easy as just tweaking a little bar that just says keep 5%, keep 4%, keep 3%.
Or debug, info, warn.
Yeah.
It's not that simple, but it is way more effective.
Yeah. I'm just trying to imagine what it would be for login to do any type of sampling, right?
Right.
You just wouldn't be able to do it, right? I mean, you just probably would be like keeping some debugging logs or keeping a percentage of the debug logs, but then you may be missing. I mean, you can do it, but you can do sampling on logs. Of course you can, but then you don't know if you're missing something important or not.
Right. You could include a request ID in all your logs.
Yeah.
And then sample based on that so that you get the entire story of a request. But which ones were slow? Good luck figuring that out from logs.
Yeah.
There's a lot more logic you need to do.
Yeah. So you're saying you're putting a trace ID in your logs and then you're sampling your logs and then you're basically reinventing traces.
Yeah. Yeah. What you need to do is on your logs, basically, what you need to do is put in trace ID, give each one of a unique ID. Okay. And then what you need to do is you need to say how long it took for that logs to actually run. So put a duration on it.
Yeah.
And then, what'd be really good is if you say which log was happening before it as well, like maybe its parent. If you put all of that stuff on your logs, it'd be amazing.
Yeah. I mean, we did, and many organizations had, previous to tracing, implemented their own ways of propagating context or like their own ways of propagating request context, right? With a transaction ID or a correlation ID. And the pain that is without, with maintaining your own custom instrumentation for HTTP clients or gRPC clients and then propagating that is something that I think is undervalues the amount of like pain that OpenTelemetry collector is taking away from companies by having a standard way to propagate context. That is one of the most impressive things.
Right. OpenTelemetry is the second biggest project in the CNCF by contributions. That's a lot of contributions. You don't want to recreate all of those.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's like, how many different languages do you use? I mean, most people are I would probably say majority of organizations, it's one, maybe two.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the outliers with acquisitions, like you were saying, your company was acquired. Now we've got Java. Like, we've never done Java before. Right, okay, all of those custom things that we created to propagate correlation. Like, correlation isn't new. Like, the trace ID concept isn't new. Correlation has existed for so long. What we've done is standardized it, standardized the format, standardized the names, standardized all the rest of it so that every language can say, oh yeah, trace parent, I know that.
Yeah.
If this was a video call, I would have put up the meme from Jurassic Park. It's like, oh yeah, correlation, I know this.
You can provide a link to that meme in the show notes. Speaking of show notes, Dan, how can people get in touch with you or find out more?
Well, they can get in touch with me on the CNCF Slack. I'm always there. There's Dan Gomez Blanco. You'll be able to find me. That's the main one. And then, of course, on LinkedIn as well.
And they can buy your book.
And yeah, of course, as well.
You said that you've been doing some talks and stuff. Have you got any more talks coming up this year?
Yes, I will say that, yeah. I will be at KubeCon in Paris. We're doing a talk on Observability Day related to some of the stuff that we were talking about today, right? So how do you actually get value out of observability and how you can basically take OpenTelemetry and then migrate to OpenTelemetry and still not have an observable system basically. It's like, you can do it badly as well. And then a panel as well on Observability Day, where I've put together some folks from other end users, basically. And we'll be talking about how OpenTelemetry, so this is completely driven by end users. And we'll be talking about some of the challenges of adopting OpenTelemetry at scale, some of the best practices, what's working with people, what's not working, and so on. And then, well, as well on the maintainers track, we'll be there with the rest of the governance committee.
Great. And for people listening to this after KubeCon in Paris in 2024, look for the videos. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you would like to suggest a topic, find us on Twitter at o11ycast. That's o11ycast. o11ycast is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com.